for those of you who already listened to sit through this. Tipsy Talks, this is our 4th year. We have been in this establishment for 4 years, which is quite remarkable. Nothing like consistency in business operations in the Northeast Kingdom that are a recipe for success, right? Because there's a lot of businesses that are like, are they open today? I just don't really know. And then you never find out because you don't go, and then they disappear. So this is part of the reason why we're here, is to support our local businesses, to bring in activity and the community for an evening of barley pops and pizza pie. Because we love places like Parker Pie. We want them to survive and thrive and continue. We want a patron here. We like the people that run them and work there. And so most of what we do at Tipsy Talks is try to bring the community together in places that we love. Jasper's Tavern is another place that we love. So we do a lot of these in Newport. We've done them at the Gap. We've done them at J Peak. We have on the J Peak show coming up in March. This is our calendar here. You might not be able to read most of it, but it's on Facebook. And you can find it. You have a question?
No, I was going to enlarge it.
Oh, with your hand.
Yeah.
Enhance. Yes. That would be nice. Yeah. Maybe the Google Glasses won't be able to do that in a couple of years. But so we come here and we rejoice in the stories that our neighbors and our friends and some strangers that we may not know their name, but now we do because they're up on stage taking a risk by talking to you about something that they're passionate about. This is one of the ways that we do that. We bring people together in places that we love, and we tell people about things that we love. So we have 2 people here tonight who are going to talk about generalized trees. And there's a lot of trees out there. We're going to hear about cultivated trees, and we're going to hear about non-cultivated trees. Both of them involve management, very different types of management. If anybody likes working and managing with trees, silviculture, orchards, whatever you want to call it, in your flavor, this is going to be quite informative. I am a fledgling orchardist in my backyard, and nothing's making fruit. But I know that the great wise man doesn't take shade beneath the mighty oak that he plants, or however that idiom goes. I do these things well. But I'm really excited because these are legacy efforts, right? People take time, they take decades, they take generations to grow trees. And so I'm really interested to hear from both of these 2 folks tonight, Lydia and Tom, about their particular flavor of tree management. So it looks like everybody's here. It looks like there's beverages and food bounty. Is anybody missing? Do we need to wait? Can we get going? Oh, Lydia's ready. Let's get Lydia up here for her first Tipsy Talk.
My name is Lydia Pendergast. I am the orchardist and assistant cider maker at Eden Specialty Ciders. I do a lot of picking apples and climbing in trees. I also help make the cider. You might have seen me on about selling the cider. A few years ago, I was a student at College of the Atlantic, where I was the research assistant to that guy. Unfortunately, that's the only photo we have together, and my eyes are completely closed. I have a curse on my face. John knows this. Where my eyes are closed in every single photo that's ever been taken of me, especially very important ones with people that I worked with for years. So at College of the Atlantic, I was the pomological research assistant to Todd Little-Siebold, who's the history professor at College of the Atlantic.
Yeah, Todd.
Yeah, Todd. He worked with the Historic Fruit Working Group of North America, which is a collective of heirloom preservation orchards across the United States. I got to intern with 2 of those organizations, MOFGA at the Maine Heritage Orchard and at the Montezuma Orchard Restoration Project. These group as a collective also worked with Cameron Peace at Washington State University Horticulture Department, where he is collecting DNA samples of trees across the U.S. to rebuild the apple family tree, trying to trace back the oldest genetics and locating different interesting things. But we'll get into that a little bit more later. This is a few of the texts that I'll be pulling from for this talk, as well as personal research that I did as an undergraduate. My capstone project, I was digitizing historic fruit work note cards at the USDA library. I was also spent a lot of my time hunched in front of a computer going through old Maine newspapers, so there's some clippings from there. I've never presented this work before, so it's kind of nerve-wracking to do that. My disclaimer about this talk is that I didn't use any AI. I used all of my brain, in case you're wondering. I also refuse to pay for the Canva premium subscription, so all of these graphics are built by hand. If you can't read them, I will email you a copy. I will email you any of my citations so you can read them, you can enjoy them, you can understand them yourself.
Yay, transparency!
Yay! But really, apples are my favorite thing. Fall is my most favorite time of year. It's really kick-ass. I think it should be everybody's favorite time of year. You can pick apples. You can make apple pie. You can make cider. Really, nothing is better than an apple. But unfortunately, I have to tell you that the apple has been lying to you. It's not just an apple. Oh, too far. It's Malus domestica, family Rosaceae, tribe Pyreae. But what does that mean? We're going to be talking about Malus domestica and the context of Malus domestica in the United States. So, okay, next page. A little bit of background. The U.S. has the second highest apple production in the world. It is second only to China. The majority of those apples are produced in Washington state. The apple industry is valued at $31 billion. They are also adapted to a pretty wide temperate range. Also, the U.S. produces 10 billion pounds of apples a year, or 5 million tons. For context, this is a bushel that we use to harvest apples in the orchard, and this is around 45 pounds. So this times like a million. So, apples also grow in a good temperate range, about 30 to 60 degrees latitude, either side of the equator. They also last very long in cold storage. This is prior to CA, or controlled atmosphere storage, which pumps CO2 into a given space and slows the metabolism of apples. But prior to this, people relied on the natural, long-lasting storage ability of apples, and we'll get into that. So, one of the key things to know about apples is that they have extreme heterozygosity. I don't exactly know 100% what that means. I'm not a geneticist, but what you should take away from this is that they reproduce very similar to humans. You have two parents, and then through a recombination of genes, you have an offspring that has a unique combination of those two parents' genes. That's why things like this chart of the University of Minnesota's breeding program is so complicated. Apples are also very long-lived, so a great-grandparent can contribute genetics to a grandchild. Very incestuous. Some apples that you might recognize from this chart are Honeycrisp, McCown, Macintosh, Jonathan is on there if anybody knows it, Liberty. And because of this, apples are a clonal crop, specifically Malus domestica. Now, when I talk about Malus domestica, I'm actually talking about what is a hybrid Malus species. Malus domestica was developed through hundreds of years of crossbreeding, hybridization through trade routes across Asia and Europe. And the Malus domestica that ended up in Europe is what was brought by settlers into the U.S. There's also native Malus species to the U.S. This is a chart pulled by an associate professor at Cornell Agritech from data from iNaturalist, if you have any familiarity with it. that shows the 4 different Malus species and their distribution across the US today. So, given this information, I wanted to throw this out to the audience. And there's multiple answers to this, so throw it out there. Why do you think the first Malus domestica in the US were grown from seed? Yes.
Getting rootstock across the ocean.
Damn you!
Lucky guess.
Any other thoughts or feelings? Okay, we'll go into it, because so many yes.
What does that mean?
What does that mean? Okay. So, like I said, Malus is a clonal crop. If you want a red delicious tree, you cannot plant a red delicious seed. Why is that? Because the seed is the offspring and will be the genetic cross between 2 parents. So, to propagate an apple, we have to take cuttings of the last year's growth, and this is known as scion wood. And this is when the tree is dormant, and that is then grafted through several different methods. The chart that I have here is bench grafting, which is the whip and tongue, or you can do things like the cleft graft, and those are planted and then grown. So you need an existing root stock. If you're looking at an older tree, evidence of grafting can be seen through sizes, changes in the bark size, changes in the bark texture, but there's also was a habit of burying the graft line, which is that whip and tongue melding of the 2. So you won't always see evidence, but you can look for things like a grid pattern, its location close to a house, or where a house used to be. Nowadays we do have rootstocks, and those rootstocks are also clonally propagated generally. But historically, prior to the 20th century, people were relying on seeds to grow their roots and their rootstock. Seeds are also the longest living version of roots that we have. They can live up to over 250 years. Yes. So there's some other things that tie into why seeds were used. And this is a publication from the Heuristic Pioneer. Okay, so this guy from Heuristic, MRK, Fruit Culture and Heuristic, which is in Maine. He says that any tree in any country where it cannot ripen its fruit will soon show signs of homesickness and die with melancholy. On this account, most of our cuttings on imported grafts have been thrown away, while native trees raised from seed here on the ground are becoming naturalized, or such varieties of them are outkeeping others as can live and bear. And along with these developments, we hear that location has much to do with success or failure. So what he's pointing to, 1858. So what MRK is pointing to, is that folks knew that apples were adaptable, and if grown from seed in a specific climate, any individual that was able to live and survive and bear fruit would be specifically adapted to the climate that they're at. And in Heuristic, you're very high north in Maine, so they were looking for very cold hardy varieties, and they were struggling finding varieties that would live up there. So, if I could get 2 assistants to help me at this point, I brought 2 apples for everyone to try. Yeah. Clap of hands for everybody. Yay! Okay, so I cut enough apples. Hopefully there'll be enough. If there isn't, then my friend Ian and Drew here will hopefully cut enough for everyone to try a piece. These apples were grown at Scott Farm in Brattleboro. Woohoo! Yeah.
Have they been in cold storage this whole time?
Oh yeah. Interestingly, okay, so these apples have been in cold storage. They have not been in controlled atmosphere storage. That is because these two apples were grown from seed during the early colonial settler history of the U.S. They are in a category known as keepers. They last very long in cold storage, not controlled atmosphere storage. They develop flavor in storage, and they are part of an heirloom category that is not grown at a larger scale, but you can find locally, such as Scott Farm. Roxbury russet, which is the russeted apple, kind of has the skin of a potato, will have more of like a vanilla-y flavor, is very sweet. Was planted from seed in Massachusetts in the early 1600s. And Baldwin was planted from seed in 1740. And both of these are still found in old orchards today and are still propagated as heirlooms today. Yeah, so does anybody tried one so far? What do you think? How are you finding them?
I like the rusted one better.
You like the russeted one better? So we were pressing these a few weeks ago, and the russets tend to be higher in sugar. Though, like, you might not be able to perceive it because the Baldwin has more acidity and some juiciness to it, but typically russets do tend to be pretty high in sugar, which could point to why Roxbury russet has been around for so long. Some people say that Roxbury russet is the oldest variety in the U.S. Oh. But how do you know that? You know, some people also say the Rhode Island breeding, which interestingly is also a keeper. Okay. I don't have this apple tonight, but I did want to talk about the Scott Winter apple, which was grown from seed in Newport, which is up in Orleans County. Is anyone from Newport? So this apple was grown from seed in Newport. What is the date? Sometime in the early 1800s. And it is still grown today. You can find it at Scott Farm. I haven't found it around Orleans County, but I'm gonna try and find it. And this is a letter that was written to the USDA Homological Division by a doctor in Newport, where he said, as this apple is hard and acid all through the winter, I regard it at first as valuable only for culinary purposes. But in April, the flesh softens, and a spicy, though not very rich, flavor is developed. And far beyond my expectations, it has become a favorite eating apple in the late spring. And that's Dr. J.H. Hodgkins. And he wrote this letter to the USDA in 1887. And this apple is still grown. And this is also in the category of keeper, if you couldn't tell from his letter. The reason why I'm talking so much about keepers is not only because they're still available to us at this point for me to share with you all, but also because a lot of people don't realize how many different culinary categories there are to apples. People are very familiar with our fresh eating, cider, baking and pie apples, sauce and jelly apples, keepers like you got to try, as well as drying. So I thought it would be interesting if folks could talk a little bit about what apples they typically get at a grocery store, and we can talk about what category they're in. Fuji? Fuji is in the fresh eating category. Honeycrisp, yes. Honeycrisp is really fascinating because that was on our chart for the University of Minnesota. That was on the chart for the University of Minnesota breeding program, and that was going to be thrown out from the University of Minnesota breeding program because they were breeding for red fruit. They wanted something with very red skin that would rival the Red Delicious. But they discovered after trying the apple that it had this amazing texture that people really, really liked, and it has now become the parent of most of the apples that you find in the grocery store. Even though it doesn't have very red skin, it has like nice stripy pink flesh, as you know. That is in the fresh eating category. Do we have any more?
Macintosh.
Gala.
Gala is an older variety in the fresh eating category. I believe it also makes a pretty good sauce. Cortland, yes, fresh eating. Macintosh, yes, fresh eating. I've also heard that people have a good time with sauce and drying those. Though I think the dried apple chips and Macintosh are a little uninteresting. Granny Smith, cool. Granny Smith is interesting because if you don't know this already, a lot of the apples that are in our grocery store are picked prior to ripeness. That makes them last longer as they're traveling long distances, which is particularly important for the Granny Smith because it is native, well, it was grown from seed in Australia. Granny Smith's actually supposed to have a massive pink blush and a very developed flavor, but we don't get to try that because it is picked very early and it's very tart, and people think of it as a pie apple. I have a lot of feelings about that, and I don't think it's a pie apple, and I would love to.
I agree.
Thank you. Okay, so you might be noticing that there is a pattern of a lot of our apples being fresh eating, sauce, drying maybe, not a lot of these other categories. So this is one of the things about historic research in apples is that folks think that we're trying to maintain a specific history, a certain heritage when we talk about heirlooms with apples, or that we're trying to maintain genetic diversity. Unfortunately, I don't think this is the case in either hand. If you think back to our Minnesota apple breeding program and the kind of incestuousness of the Malus domestica family tree, we're not losing genetics. We're just kind of refining them over time into more fresh eating apples. What I and a lot of my peers are look to when we're thinking about historic apple preservation, we're looking more towards the diversity in traits and culinary usage, which kind of ties into our food security. Not a lot of people have access to controlled atmosphere storage. If you're growing on a home scale, if you're growing food for your neighbors, you want things that are gonna last long in storage, that are gonna have multiple purposes, that are gonna feed you through the winter. So from a growing standpoint, it also is good for climate. I know that this past spring was very cold, and I was happy to have so many different varieties in my orchard that weren't blossoming when the late frosts came, so we could have a crop, a regional crop that could then be distributed. And I feel like I'm harking on a point here. I'm kind of like, but the point of the matter is that when we talk about the history of Malus domestica in the US, we're talking about the settler colonial history of the US. Is not very nice to think about. The colonial settlers brought tools with them that kind of took over the land like a virus. The commodification of land, tying land ownership to privilege and power, the trafficking and displacement of other humans, religion, religious entitlement to land, manifest destiny, and imperialism, such as denouncing and discrediting other countries and communities. And I am getting soapbox here, but when I tell you that doing historic research and looking at these patterns over and over again, it starts to really illustrate how kind of rotten to the core some of these things are, not to be on point.
Points for Lydia.
So we're gonna look at an example of this in that we're gonna talk about something that has happened historically in the past, and we're going to look about how that has been contextualized moving forward. This is a map of Geneva, New York, which is currently home to what is probably the largest collection of apples and Malus species, not just Malus domestica, in the world. This was historically home to 40+ Seneca communities as well as their orchards. In fact, Native Americans were early adopters of Malus and different crops. During westward expansion, there were orchards that were discovered over time, and are they talked about? No. But it kind of points to immense community ties to the land that were very convenient to erase. So Geneva was home to 40 plus Seneca communities. And in 1779, this man, John Sullivan, was sent by George Washington. And he was sent to occupy and keep the land from the British. What in reality this involved was the destruction of those 40 plus communities, the burning of their homes, the destruction of their crops, and the girdling of trees. If you aren't familiar with girdling, it's where you cut into the trees deep enough to get rid of the xylem and phloem to the trees. If they have a crop on them, you could then get the apples and hopefully eat them if you're Sullivan's crew. But the trees would die the next year. So this left the Seneca without home, without crop. They either had to flee to the British or and post-war, were they able to return to that land? So we're going to look at how this has been talked about more recently. This is from 1927. It's a publication that talks about how the Seneca were advanced land stewards, but not quite up to the colonial settler standard, as they used hand tools and fish fertilizer. As a holistic, leading biodynamic grower, I can tell you that we are returning to a lot of these practices now. My company spends about $45 a gallon on fish fertilizer, which this same publication is belittling communities for using and saying that they just weren't up to snuff. It also details how Sullivan's crew had a vision of fertility of the land in Geneva, how they were then gifted this land for their contributions to Sullivan's efforts in the area, and were able to then turn it into farmland and advance their families. So, given that, we kind of get an idea of how history changes narratives of what has happened over time. And I can't talk about apples without talking about the big one. Is anybody familiar with this? Man, what do we know about him?
Not a good guy.
What a great guy.
What a great guy! Amazing. Look at him. He's just like walking barefoot. He has a pot on his head. Disney, right? So some people know him as a frontier superhero, along with John Henry and Paul Bunyan, clearing the forest, laying the railroads. He was benevolent. He was spreading seed all over the land of these apples. He introduced apples to the West, and some of this has some truth to it. John Chapman was a real live man. He was born, I'm gonna find the dates here. He was born in 1774, but given that he had no land to inherit and a little bit of a difficult home life, he ended up floating around and working a variety of jobs. He ended up in western Pennsylvania. He had a hard time, it seemed, holding community, finding his place. Some of this might have to do with some of his religious extremism. He also got into a lot of trouble when he had some interactions with some underage women. He was an adopter of Swedenborgian religion, which later led into the Transcendentalist movement. He found that during the expansion into Ohio, he could take up a bunch of odd jobs. At one point, he is driving cattle into Ohio. He also found out that he could take seed from apples that were pressed in the cider mills and pull the seed from the pomace of what apples were pressed for free. He could then travel west with a bag of these apples. If you remember how hard it is to transport grafts of apples, it's much easier to move seed. He could then plant them along streams in land that he did not ask anybody to use. and turn a profit, because in Ohio at the time it was a requirement that all new settlers planted trees because it showed a commitment to the land, that they would build deeper roots than, you know, just planting a crop for 1 or 2 years and then moving on. They wanted people to establish a homestead. They wanted people to keep Native Americans off of the land. So he also used his constant travel as a way to promote his religion. And he did, in fact, we do have receipts of him buying shoes, and he would send money to his family from time to time to also allow them to move west. It is later in life that he took a vow of poverty, and he was never a man of great wealth. But yeah, so that's the end of my talk. I was hoping that, I wrote out a few of what I'm hoping your takeaways is that Miles domestica, apples, still a really great fruit. They play a huge culinary role. They have a diverse culinary usage. They do have a deep and complicated history in the US. And you should always question who is telling you a history and a narrative and why. Even me. So if you want any of my citations, if you want any of my books, let me know, because firsthand research is never as good as hearing it from someone else. Okay, I will also open the floor to any questions, and there are apples here for anybody who liked what they tried and wants to take a few home. Okay. Emily, yeah.
What's your favorite apple?
Oh no! Okay, my go-to response for that is the first apple that I learned to identify. Part of my work in heirloom orchards was learning to identify them, so folks with heirloom orchards would bring you fruit. The first apple that I learned to identify was the Northern Spy.
That's my favorite.
It's a good one, it's a good one, yes.
What's your favorite baking apple? And second question, are people allergic to apples? I have a daughter, we have a daughter who's allergic to gala apples. Nothing else, but galas she reacts to. She has itchy throat. Do you know anything about that?
Okay, my favorite baking apple is also Northern Spy.
Okay.
There's an old saying, spies for pies, because they make the best pie apple. They hold up under baking for a long amount of time, and they soften to like just the right texture. And if you've tried any Eden ciders, you know that we have a single varietal Northern Spy ice cider that has an amazing like peppercorn quality to it. It's probably one of my favorite ice ciders that we make. And as for the allergy thing, it's kind of weird that it's specifically gala, because I would maybe point to like growing practices, but also it sounds kind of nuanced. I'm not an allergist. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Do we have any other questions? Eleanor.
Sorry, I can just answer the allergy question.
Oh yeah.
Are folks who are sensitive to the proteins that are in an
Right,
apple,
right.
in a raw apple?
Yeah,
So it's probably not just gala, it just may be that the gala she's eating have a particular
right.
amount of that.
Allergic to nectarines but not peaches, kind of,
Right.
you know?
Yeah, it's just, it's also that just for,
Yeah,
that
it's
protein goes away when you ferment stuff, so she can still have cider.
She can still have cider. Great. There was one. Yes.
Are you familiar with transparent apples?
Yes, yes. Yellow transparent apples are an heirloom apple. I believe they're Russian lineage. Yeah.
Are they transparent?
They have a very
clear.
clear, transparent yellow skin.
Wow.
Yes.
What's in the nature of the composition of apples that allows them to be stored for such a lengthy period of time? I mean, you can get really down with a tomato. It's just
Yeah.
so
I think it's most of the sugar content.
Lots of cellulose structure.
Yeah.
And it's actual like tannin.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you for giving me the information about Granny Smith's, which of course I thought was a British apple, and I happen to love it in more ways than one. I could cook it whenever I can. Have you heard of Cox's orange pippins?
Oh yeah, that's up there for one of my favorite apples. Yeah, I love Cox's Orange Pippin. They're actually part of this grouping of apples that are both have this really great orange flesh with like a russet over them, so they're very sweet and very great. Orange Pippin, Cox's Orange Pippin, Orange Sweet, and I believe Ashmead's Kernel are all genetically related to each other. And they all tie back to Ribston Pippin, if you're familiar. So they're part of this like grouping of orangey russeted apples that I think the whole group, big fan.
What's Pippin mean?
Pippin, some people say Pippin for a seedling or an apple grown from seed, but it's also just a general name theme that we see across apples. Yes?
So why is it that so many hybridized varieties exist with like crabs and hawthorns and cultivated apples, and I mean it seems more so than other fruiting trees. Is that a misassumption?
Yes. I mean, I'm not sure exactly, but I think it could tie back to the fact that everybody loves apples. They're just great, man. Who doesn't love an apple? Okay, do I have time for a few more?
You got one more, I think.
Okay, one more.
Oh, I was just wondering, we have, a bunch of different varieties of apples in our yard. And I was just wondering, like, is there somewhere we can go to maybe help us identify some of those apples? We're not, like, I'm not sure. Like, some taste sweet, some are tart.
Yeah, that's a
some
great
are-
question.
Some are green, some are red. Yeah.
Bring up Lydia.
So, yes, I can help you. There's like 3 steps I would say to identifying an apple. And the first step is baseline, figuring out whether or not you have a grafted or a seed tree, because from seed, it's not going to be identifiable. You can like figure out the flavor and the type in its culinary use, but like I said, it's going to be a genetically unique individual. If it is planted in like a grid system and you have evidence of grafting, then we can start to work on an identification process, looking at the age of the tree. Further down the line, there is public DNA testing through Cameron Peace, who I mentioned earlier. They work pretty slow because it is like through the university, and it's very hard when people are sending you like 100 samples of Macintosh to DNA test, so they have to try and prioritize based off of the student's workload. Anyway.
Yeah, I would
so,
say our trees are probably about 30 years old or more.
So we're talking like that big?
They're
big?
like the angry orchard trees.
Okay, cool. Great.
That's not a good cider though.
No,
Okay, well, thank you so much, everybody. I can take more questions during the break, or anytime you can email me at Eden. I love helping people out. I can send you so many research resources, anything. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, well, you guys are all sitting tight, so we'll get going with the next one. I see Tom in the crowd. Tom's going to come up and tell us about some trees that grow a little bit taller than him.
I'm going to dispel a few myths tonight, and one of them is that loggers are bad people, or that the work they do is bad. That they go out across the landscape and they just cut down trees and make a mess, and anybody that cuts down trees must be doing something wrong. And I just wanted to kind of like dispel that myth, because loggers are just a contractor, just like lots of other contractors, plumbers, electricians. And if you hire somebody, a contractor, to do some work for you, one of the first things you want to do is give them some direction and some sideboards. And loggers are just really good at cutting down trees and hauling them to a mill or some other processing facility. So they're a valuable part of our community and our area. And so if you've got, like for example, we had to have somebody do some yard work for us. So we hired a contract landscaper, a yard maintenance company. And the first thing I did was tell him, now there's some trees over here, little trees, you gotta watch out for that. And I've got a power line that goes to the bee yard that keeps the bears out, and there's a hose for the garden. So I gave him some, some direction. And it's the same thing with the logger. You know, if I was going to court, I would want to hire somebody, an attorney, to help represent me, right? Same thing with the timber sale. If you decide, well, I want to thin out my woods, I want to open things up a little bit, maybe make some money from the timber, I want somebody to do some logging. First thing you want to do is hire somebody that can help you and represent you. So a lot of times a logger will knock on the door and say, I see you got 40 acres of woods here, and I could help you cut some trees, and I'd offer you like $5,000 to take some timber off your land. And it might sound pretty good, but would you just let him go to work and do his thing? No, you'd want somebody that would be able to kind of direct his work. And that's where the consulting forester comes in. Now, a logger is very specifically trained on cutting trees and hauling trees, but you want somebody that knows about your woods and knows about the trees, the different species, how to manage them. So that's where the consulting forester comes in. And these are independent businessmen and women that make forest management plans and plan timber harvests. So if you decided you wanted to cut some timber, the first thing you'd want to do would be to find a consulting forester. And there's lists, there's a state forester in Craftsbury, Jared Nunnery. Anybody know Jared? Jared Nunnery? Yeah, Jared's a great guy, I really like Jared. But Jared is a government forester like I was. And so he's there to help landowners make that step between the logger and the consulting forester. He'll give you a list of both loggers and consulting foresters. But the consulting forester will go out there and actually mark the trees. If the logger is just, told, okay, go ahead and do what you want, he's gonna pick out the trees that fit his objectives and fit the mill. He's gonna pick out the best trees and send them to the mill. If you want the best trees to stay on your property, you want the consulting forester out there and actually marking the trees. I had a good example. A fella had a logger knock on the door and say, I'll give you $10,000. I see you have a lot of nice walnut out here, and I'll thin out your walnut for you, and I'll offer you about $10,000 for the walnut I could cut. And he said, well, I've been working with a consulting forester for years, so you can go ahead and take a look, but I'm going to have my consultant step in before we actually do anything. So they went and marked some trees, the log buyer, and then he had a consulting forester come in. Consulting forester changed all the marking, marked it completely differently, and he puts together a bid on the timber. He'll tally up the species and the sizes and the wood volume and everything, and then he'll send it to all the timber buyers in the area, maybe 10 or 15 different buyers, and get competitive bids, and then take the highest bid. Well, in this case, the same company that first knocked on the door and offered him $10,000 ended up being the high bidder, and they bid almost twice that much, and the trees they took were completely different. They took most of the bad stuff and left most of the good stuff. So where I'm going with this is everybody that's ever worked with a consulting forester is always happier with the results than if they just hired a logger. But the logger is the guy who can actually do the work. The kind of worst case example of how bad things can go is California. And I'm from California, and there's a lot of things I love about California, but there's a lot of things that really have gone south in California, and one of them is the forest products industry. There used to be, I don't know, somewhere in the hundreds of sawmills or different forest product companies in California. They're down now to 12. There's 12 working sawmills left in California. And if you needed a logger to do some work for you, he would probably be coming from 3 or 4 counties over. Just like everything else, the whole forest products infrastructure in California has just collapsed. So when they had a drought and a lot of trees dying, and they needed to get those dead trees out of the woods, there weren't enough loggers and mills left to get the job done. And I heard stories about trees being cut and just piled up and burned. Big logs that could have been used to make furniture and homes and everything, and there was nobody left to do the logging. So I just wanted to kind of toot my horn there for both loggers and consulting foresters. Another myth I'd like to dispel is that clear cutting is always bad. Now, as a trained forester, clear cuts are about as boring as you can imagine. You draw a line around an area and say, okay, we're gonna cut down every tree. How much training and experience do you need to set up a clear-cut timber sale? Not very much. But, and I agree, clear cuts don't look very good in the first couple years after they occur, but there's a time and a place. And how many folks experienced the ice storm that there was a really bad ice storm? I know we have family in Quebec, and you know, they were without power for, I don't know, 3 weeks or something. But the thing that I noticed, because we drove through there the summer after that ice storm, and I had never seen, it looked like, you know, huge areas had just been through a tornado or something. Everything was busted up. Trees were not only on the ground, but the ones that were still standing had every branch broken and the tops broken out. It was just a mess. So with something like that, the best you can do is just reset the whole clock. And I would agree, large clear cuts are bad news because you don't have any place for the tree seeds to come in and regenerate the forest. But smaller clear cuts, in some cases, it's the best thing you can do. If everything is lousy, if you've got just a mess out there, might as well start over. Another example is if a stand has been high graded. And high grading is where, the worst case scenario I was talking about with the logger, where you just turn a logger loose with no direction, and you take all the good stuff out and leave all the bad stuff. If that's happened, the best thing you can do is cut everything and start over. And either depend on the seed to come in from outside or do some tree planting. But I've seen stands, and this was in Michigan, and you know, Vermont has some great trees and some great forest land, but some of the best I've ever seen is Michigan. I think just because the soil's so deep and there's so many different species, but I remember going into a stand and thinking, you know, there isn't a single tree here that looks any good. It's either the wrong species, ash, elm, red maple, box elder, something that doesn't have a whole lot of value for anything, for wildlife or timber or recreation or visual quality. And that's all that's out here. And even the ones that are standing here, they're all busted up and broken and half dead, you know. And I said, what happened here? And somebody said, well, this has been high graded. You know, somebody came and took out all the good stuff. So if you got a situation like that, where you know you could grow something better, and it's just a mess, well, maybe the best thing to do is cut it off and start over again. So, again, clear cuts, another thing that can happen, something like emerald ash borer comes through, and all the trees die at once, or most of them. And if you know you can grow something better, maybe best thing to do is to cut them and start over. I did a lot. I worked in North Carolina, and they do a lot of clear cutting down there. But we went into a stand once that was probably about 15 years old. It had been clear cut. And the species in there, they had something like 15 different species. There was a lot to choose from. I just remember thinking, this obviously has not been high graded because it's got such a great variety. They've got a lot to work with now. Well, something about Vermont, I think maybe most of you know this, but there was a time when there were almost no trees in Vermont. Have you ever seen some of the old pictures, even around like Newport, where you can see all the way to the horizon, there's not a standing tree? Cut. But Vermont wants to be forest land. It wants to be forest. So it all came back. And we have now a really nice mix of species, something we can work with. Another thing I think some folks might not appreciate is just the the value of the forest products industries that we have. The company that really comes to mind for me is Columbia Forest Products. When I moved here and found out there was a hardwood veneer plywood plant in our little town, I thought, wow, there aren't that many of those. That's a real high-end product. They make red oak veneer, or red oak plywood that's used for some pretty high-end furniture and different kinds of applications. They employ 130 people, over 130 people in Newport. It's one of the biggest employers in town. And, you know, just a real high-value product. I see these big red oak logs coming in on log trucks, and I think, wow, that's coming to our little town, and they're making some really nice products out of it. So, the word discriminate is usually got a negative connotation, but when it comes to forestry, it's okay to discriminate among trees. And I have my favorites. I mean, I guess we all do. Well, maybe foresters more so than others, but and I have some that I'm not that fond of. And I hate to keep beating on this, but I'm not real crazy about red maple. There's just too much of it, you know. And the other thing is it doesn't live that long. Of course, I had a coworker point out to me, "Come on, Tom, the red maple's gonna outlive all of us." But compared to sugar maple, red maple is short-lived, has real soft wood, doesn't have any particular timber value. Comparing it to hard maple, sugar maple, it just doesn't make the grade. And the other thing about red maple is there's so darn much of it. It can come in just solid, you know, where you have, you know, 3/4 of the trees you've got out there are red maple. So it's just like there's a little too much red maple in most cases. And then there's ash, it comes in too fast too. So,
but it's prettier than box elder.
yeah, it is, and it's, the fall colors are fantastic. So I want some red maple in my forest land, but we don't need as much as there is. So the other myth I'd like to kind of dispel is that it's always bad to cut a tree. And I've had coworkers at USDA. I had a biologist coworker, and I said something about timber sales and tree cutting, and he pretty much said, "It's always bad to cut trees, always bad." Wait a minute. And now my closest colleagues in USDA were often the biologists because they understood the value of habitat, wildlife habitat. And a lot of times, the way they could achieve their habitat goals was to cut a few trees. And one of the things you can do is thin a stand to favor the trees you want. And that's what the consulting forester will do. He'll go through, and the way they put it is we cut the worst first. So the first time they go in, they take out the trees that are too abundant and not particularly valuable, and leave the ones that have multiple benefits and that are more long-lived. So examples in Vermont would include one of my favorite, northern red oak, of course sugar maple, but black cherry, and you can grow black walnut here. There's black walnut, native black walnut. Those are among the hard, yellow birch. These are all long-lived species that have high timber value and often have a lot of wildlife value too. Black cherry has the soft mass, they call it, the cherries that birds will eat in the summer, and then red oak has the acorns that are, you know, really valuable wildlife food. Sugar maple has, there's birds that will eat the seeds, but basswood is a really good pollinator. Anybody ever had basswood honey? Basswood honey is some of the best. And if you're ever close to a basswood tree in the summer when it's blooming, there's this fragrance that will just, I mean, the first time I smelled it, I thought, where is that coming from? It smells like heaven, you know? So it's just really fantastic. So these trees that have multiple benefits, those are the ones that we kind of favor. And, you know, I'm not saying that you want to get rid of all the red maple or get rid of all the ash, but if you've got the opportunity to favor these better ones, and that's where the consulting forester comes in. He takes a look at your whole stand and figures out how you can kind of balance things and make things a little better. So it's okay to discriminate when you're planning your forest land and managing your forest land. Are there any sheep farmers in the audience? I know David Templeman. I really like David. He's a representative who lives out by Westfield. But anyway, he's a sheep farmer, and I know David would not have a problem with this. But just like red maple and ash, sometimes there can be too many sheep because, as I understand it, the reason that they cut down all the forest in Vermont way back in I guess the 17 or 1800s was for sheep. So I guess at one point Vermont had more sheep than trees, and I guess I'm just kind of glad we kind of flipped things and now we have more trees than sheep. A little more balance. Those were kind of the high points I wanted to hit on forest management. So if you saw my title and thought forest management good or bad, well, that was to be kind of provocative and controversial, because I was not going to stand up here and say forest management was a bad thing. But it really depends exactly on what you want. And the first thing that we would do as government foresters and a consulting forester would be to interview the landowner and figure out exactly why they're holding their forest land. Why do you have forest land and what do you want to do with it? And depending on your goals and objectives, you can kind of tweak things. So, and it doesn't matter if you're interested in timber, wildlife, recreation, visual quality, any of these things. There's management that you can do to move things in your direction. Even if you just want to see more wildlife or even just have a little bit more access to your property. Because Vermont wants to be forest, we can have too many trees. And I think you've probably all seen that, where the forest is so dense and thick that you can barely fight your way through it. And it can be that crowded when it's really young, when the trees are really young and small, but even when they get older, just too full, and you need to open things up. And even the wildlife will benefit from that. My biologist friends would always point out that diversity, it was good for whatever wildlife species you're talking about, because the more different kinds of habitat you have, the more different kinds of wildlife you'll see. So a lot of times it was my biologist friends that were talking about small clear cuts. They call them young forest and openings. The word clear cut has a lot of negative connotations, but what they were driving at was there are wildlife species that need to have those openings in that young forest. And if all your forest is the same age and the same height, you're only going to get a limited number of wildlife species that can use that forest. So the more you kind of break things up, open things up. The other thing I point out is you're going to have a lot more plants growing in the understory on the ground level if you get some light to the ground. If it's dark, you're going to have very little growing on the ground, and that includes wildflowers and a lot of the fruiting shrubs like blackberries and raspberries and blueberries. If you don't have any light hitting the ground, you're not going to see very many of those. So opening things up a little bit will give you a lot more diversity, and I think a lot more visual quality, and even kind of like better access. If it's recreation that you're interested in, even just building some trails and open things up a little bit so you can kind of move around a little bit more. So I've got some slides, some pictures to illustrate some of these forest management ideas. Oh, here we go. So this is a clear cut, and the thing I'm trying to illustrate here is just that there are trees coming back. Now, it didn't even look this good probably 2 years ago. In other words, 2 years ago, you would have seen a lot more slash on the ground, a lot less green. But even in this picture, you can see that there are trees coming back, young trees coming back. Now, this is the kind of thing that you really should cut down because they say there's two kinds of clear cuts. There's what's called a commercial clear cut, where again, the logger has just been told, okay, cut whatever you want. And then there's what's called a silvicultural clear cut, that is, it's been planned by a forester, and a silvicultural clear cut, they want to see everything hit the ground. You don't want to see scattered box elder, gray birch, willow, stuff that you don't want, or trees that are pretty scary looking. So all those should have come down in a proper clear cut. Now this might be, I don't know, this could be as much as 5 acres, I guess. And to actually get red oak back in an opening, I'm told you need at least 2 acres to get enough light into that opening that the red oak will come back. So anyhow, I just want to make the point that there is a place for clear cutting. Now, here's an example of thinning. This is actually the same stand before it was thinned and after it was thinned. And this still doesn't look that great because all this slash is still here, but I would say in 2 or 3 years, that would all pretty much disappear. That would all be decomposed, and things would look, and I've got some pictures of what it looks like even later after the thinning. But you can see, you know, you'd have a hard time, and so you would have a hard time walking through that, and so would any animal, a moose or a deer. So anyhow, this has got a lot of benefits. One of which is this is now gonna green up quite a bit. You don't see too much here besides some invasive shrubs. This was privet. This happens to be loblolly pine in Virginia, but it could be red pine in Vermont or white pine in Vermont. And then that's what it looks like a few years later. Now this happens to be a picture of what's called silvopasture, where we're actually promoting the growth of grass underneath to do a little bit of grazing. A little bit of grazing. You would never leave the cattle in the woods for very long, just for maybe a few days or maybe a week, and then you'd move them. But anyhow, the point being just that you see how open it is, how much grass you have in the understory, and also the growth on these trees is really accelerated. When you thin them out, you get a lot faster growth on the remaining trees. And then this is a little bit later. And this happens to be longleaf pine. So again, this is southern pines, but it could be red pine in Vermont. Now this is real common. This is what happens anytime you open things up in Vermont and other places. You get a lot of little trees. And if you don't step in at some point like this guy and do a little bit of thinning, they're all growing up together. They're all competing for light. Light is the most limiting resource for these trees. And the trees that lose the competition for light, that fall behind and start to get into the shade, they're gonna die. Now, if you happen to have some oak, cherry, maple mixed in there and they start falling behind to the elm, ash, cottonwood, and red maple that you're not so fond of, things can go in the wrong direction. And you have an opportunity at this stage to steer them in the right direction, to say, okay, these are the trees I want to keep. I'm going to cut a few around. So what he's doing there, he's finding the trees he wants to keep, and now he's going to cut 2 or 3 trees around, make a little kind of opening around those trees that he wants to keep, and make sure they get the sunlight and they make it all the way through. So he's kind of directing the progress of the stand at an early age. Now this is the same kind of stand later, and again, it's a lot older, but it's still, you can kind of appreciate it's too crowded, and you don't see anything growing underneath. So we're going to thin this. Look, well, that's a different. I'll come back to that. Come back to that one. But they're going in here again. They're marking the trees they want to keep and opening it up around them. And here's an example where it's been thinned on this side, and then this is what it looked like before it was thinned. And you can see the stumps here, but they picked the best trees and given them more room. And now these trees will grow much faster, and you'll get some plants in the understory, and that's about what it looks like once it's greened up. So I'm going to go back a couple now. Okay. this is one I like because I'm a big fan of black cherry. And the black cherry, they say that the bark looks like burnt potato chips. So it's pretty easy to pick out the black cherry. This, obvious one. But there's one, there's one, there's one, there's one. And the other trees around them are mostly ash. So my recommendation to this fellow was find those cherries, and then the ash trees that are right around them, they gotta go. And you can see there's a lot more ash than cherry. So just make sure that the cherry gets the light and accelerate the growth on those cherries. That's really a nice looking tree. And now this is a picture of high grade. So this is where things have gone bad. And they just finished a cut in here, and you can see the trees they left are not really that remarkable. So this no doubt looked a lot better before the cut. And this would be an example where a logger knocked on the door and said, I'll give you $10,000 for your trees, and then what you're left with is something you wish you hadn't done. And it can take 30 years to recover from a bad timber sale. On the other hand, a good one just keeps getting better. I had a fella say that his first timber sale paid for the land, and his second timber sale paid for his house, and the third one paid for his kid's college education. And these were about 10 or 15 years apart. And the first one, they took out mostly what you would consider pulpwood or firewood, real low quality stuff. But after that, it just kept getting better and better and better because it was steering the whole stand in the right direction using a consulting forester. I think that covers it because I think I kind of jumped around a little bit. So good forest management, good or bad? If you do it right, it's always good. And it's possible to do it right. Any questions?
Okay, so when people get cut around here, oftentimes a couple years later you'll just see like all the suckers coming up from the base. Basal suckers, They'll get 5 stems coming up from a root.
From the stump?
From the stump.
Yeah.
What do you do? Because none of those are going to grow into great trees.
Probably not. And that would be more likely with something like a clear cut or a pretty heavy cut where there's enough light. And if there's if you've left more trees, they'll start to shade those out. The other thing, of course, if there's none of those suckers that you want, you can just keep cutting them, or you can spray them. I'm not a big fan of herbicide, but you can use herbicide in a very targeted way. A cut stump where you've got a sprayer and you got a fresh cut and you just put enough on there to cover that cut stump. That's not really gonna go anywhere. The tree's gonna suck it down to the roots and kill it. So it's a very targeted use of an herbicide. That'd be a use of an herbicide that's real low impact.
Why do you like black cherry?
Because it's one of the finest timber species. So anybody have any black cherry furniture? I think it's the most beautiful furniture quality wood, and for a lot of different uses. I just think it's a beautiful wood. It grows relatively fast, and then it's got the multiple benefits, the flowers for pollinators and the fruit for wildlife. And it's relatively long-lived, and it's just got a lot of things going for it.
Are you very familiar with New England forests pre-colonial times? And if so, if a landowner asked, how can I get my forest more similar to what it has been, what would you recommend?
I don't know. I've read the books about folks that first moved east from the coast, and how giant trees and they say a squirrel could run from Massachusetts all the way to Ohio and not touch the ground. The canopy was that dense. And frankly, I'm afraid that we probably don't still have the same quality of soil left that they had in those days. There's been some erosion that occurred. But that's another benefit or reason for doing some management, because you can steer the species composition in the forest towards the older, longer-lived trees, and also accelerate the growth on it, so that you can start to achieve at least the appearance of an old-growth forest by doing some very careful management.
Do you know what gives woods such as, tiger maple or bird's eye their unique figuring?
No, and I think there's some theories that there may be like a virus or some microorganism that causes that figuring, but I don't think it's known for sure. The very best timber buyers can, to some degree, begin to predict whether they'll find that in a tree from the appearance, but it's not. It's very hard to do and not very accurate. In other words, they don't get it right every time.
They won't know until it's cut.
Yeah, in most cases, they have no idea until it's cut. Yeah, it's beautiful material.
We've had some clusters of bird's eye and tiger maple in our woods, and they're clustered right together.
It could be genetic.
Yeah.
Could easily be genetic.
Yeah.
When you were talking about a gentleman that paid for his land, paid for his house, and the kids, how big a lot?
I think he had about 200 acres and deep, rich soil, and he, there's an expression, something like, we've been given a gift by our ancestors, and so we need to manage what we got. He inherited some forest land that was probably, it had probably been in trees for 200 years or something. So he had a real good resource to start with. Robert?
So do you run into the issues of, I have 8 trees on my property, I hire a forester who hires a logger, and whether he cuts all 8 trees on my property or goes on to the neighbors and cuts there, do you run into issues with that?
I'm not sure. The thing I hear a lot is that there's a minimum operating size, and it varies quite a bit from place to place and from logger to logger and the quality of the forest and everything. But what I heard in North Carolina was that it was up to about 40 acres when I left there. And it used to be less than that. It used to be you could attract somebody for 10 or 15 acres, but the cost of mobilization is what they call it, but moving the equipment to the site and doing the job, they won't set up and work for less than like 40 acres or something like that. I don't know if that's answers your question. Now, one thing that folks can do to overcome that is get together with their neighbors. So you got 10 acres, the guy next to you has 20, the next guy has 30, and you all go together and contract with a consultant and then a logger to do the job.
My question is about silvopasture. How many folks have you run across that are turning to silvopasture, and who do you find are good candidates for it? Like, what role does it play in their agricultural work?
Great question. It's really hit and miss. It's an unusual producer that's a really good candidate for it, because you have to be practicing intensive rotational grazing to begin with, because these silvopastures are really only suited to be grazed for maybe 3 or 4 days, 2 or 3 times a year. But the way we explain it to folks is this could be the pasture you want when we have 3 or 4 90-degree days in a row. or when we have a blizzard coming, that will be your shade in a heat wave, and a place where the cattle will have green grass and cooler temperatures when it's 90 degrees. And on the other hand, that's where they'll have some shelter when there's a really bad storm if you're still grazing outside. But and it would be somewhat a livestock producer who's got forest land and wants some more forage, some more pasture, but also wants that shade and shelter. So that's kind of how we sell it. And it's really a win-win, because it's one more reason to do a good job of thinning, which will accelerate the growth on the trees, and it will, it's a forest health thing. It's a good thing for both the forest and the grass and the livestock. So, but it has to be a producer who's already pretty intensively managing his cattle and his forage. Any other questions?
Yeah, in the shade back here.
Yeah.
So kind of with the silvopasture vein, and then Patrick's comment about sprouts coming from stumps, how are you all encouraging or discouraging coppicing and pollarding, especially for places that don't have 200 acres but have 5 to 10 acres that really want to have a lot of regenerative wood and make income off of this wood-based product?
I was coming at it with Patrick where you didn't want those sprouts, but if the sprouts are coming from a tree, a species that you want, or if you just need, even if it's it's something like red maple is not your favorite tree, but you need a tree in that place, then if you want to pick the best sprout, let them come up for a year or two, and pick the strongest one, and then cut the others and favor that one, and it will grow up into it can grow up into a good tree from a stump sprout. So yeah, coppicing is definitely something you can do.
Is this something you're all encouraging and educating, further, onto your students or pupils or landowners to say, here's another way to be regenerative in some way? And
yeah, it's another form of forest regeneration. After you've cut, like meat and opening, you can use that mix of sprouts and seedlings. And of course, the sprouts are going to really take off because they've got an existing root system. So those could be your biggest and tallest trees, your fastest growing trees. Yeah, we'll take it.
Do you have time to talk about silviculture in Paraguay?
Silvopasture in Paraguay? I guess so. I had an opportunity, there's a large area just south of the Amazon. It's actually the second largest natural forest on the planet after the Amazon. So it's this enormous forest area, but it's dry compared to the Amazon as a rainforest. This is almost like it's not a desert, but it's dry. So the trees are only about 40 to 60 feet tall, where in the Amazon they're probably 150 or more feet tall. So it's a shorter forest, and it's all thorny, but it's incredibly diverse. I think there were something like 180 different tree species or something in the Chaco. It's called the Chaco, the Grand Chaco. And somebody got the great idea that you could graze cattle. And that's, you really couldn't grow crops there because the summers are hot and dry, and then there's enough rain in the winter that these thorny, kind of stunted trees would grow. So they figured out, well, if we clear all these and plant a grass, we can graze cattle. Well, it works, and they have a livestock industry there, but they're clearing forests that supported a real great diversity of wildlife, and of course they're also changing the whole environment, and they're going from about maybe 100 plant species per acre to 1, the grass species that they're growing for the livestock. So there's a lot of downsides to it, and the idea was, well, let's try and get some trees back. We don't want to, ruin the livestock industry that's in place here, but what can we do to get some trees back? So we were talking to him about silvopasture, and the idea was to get about maybe 30% cover. So from 100% tree cover to get back, and then down to 0 for the grazing. We're saying let's put back about 30%, and the shade will benefit the livestock, and it will actually make the grass grow better too, because a little bit of shade cools the ground and retains more moisture. We were making the case that they actually would have better pasture grass production with a certain amount of shade than just full sun. Now, we were fighting against the establishment. They had 3 big ag livestock cooperatives that were functioning. I mean, they were supporting the livestock industry there, but they, in my opinion, were very entrenched in the old ways of doing things. So when we would make a presentation to them and say, we'd like to get some more trees back out there. Oh, no, that will reduce the amount of grass that we can grow, and it will reduce the amount of beef production that we can have. And we're saying, no, we actually think the opposite is true. But we were, up against the old ways of doing things. And we were making progress, though. There were, I think there were 20 different producers that were trying this and getting a nice mix of trees out there, getting good success. And our feeling was that if the neighbors saw the success that some of these silvopasture producers were having, they'd start to think, yeah, maybe I'll try that too. But it was fascinating because they had to work really hard to keep the trees from coming back. Just like Vermont, Paraguay wants to be forest, and you have to fight Mother Nature to keep it from going back to forest. So folks that would just walk away from a 100-acre pasture, in 10 years, the trees would be 15 feet tall and just a solid cover, just by letting it go and letting the seed come back. And so what we were saying is, let that process happen, and then go through and pick the ones you want to keep and cut the rest and open things up. You can work with what you've got, is pretty much the idea. So we're hoping that happens. Looking at a satellite image of the area that we worked in, when I first saw it, I thought, oh, we've lost this, it's too late. Because just, huge areas, big square blocks of grass with not a single tree in sight. But like I say, I think we're kind of working our way from the edges and starting to turn things around a little bit in Paraguay with silvopasture. That'll be it.
Thank you. Well, now you're all equipped to be your own logger, so go forth and prosper. Thank you all for coming out to our second event of the year. Our next series showing will be at Jasper's in 2 weeks. Let me get a reminder schedule. Oh yes. Okay. Our next speakers at Jasper's on the 3rd of February is going to be Mike Beauchamp. Mike is a Quebecois now. He was from Manitoba, I want to say, and he's going to take us through the exploration of abandoned buildings, places like Detroit and Nikola Tesla's laboratory. And we're also going to hear from Kelly Newton, who spent several years in the Kyrgyz Republic as a Peace Corps member. So you're going to hear some interesting tales next 2 Tuesdays from now. Jasper's, 6:30. I'll see you there. Thank you.